I find it interesting that all of these girls who are in all of these online beefs all got either a project coming out or threatening to put a project out. It's wild. It's like they're taking all of this weirdo gossip and, they're doing it for clout. There is no Diddy tolerance. This is a no Diddy.
What if the truth didn't come from receipts, but from someone who's seen the industry from the inside and has nothing left to protect? Because when Jaguar Wright speaks, people don't listen for polish. They listen for damage, for patterns, for the kind of honesty that only comes from someone who's already been burned by the machine. And this time, she didn't hold back. According to Jaguar Wright, the situation involving Claressa Shields and Papoose isn't just messy relationship drama. She suggests it's something much more familiar, another example of how powerful men move through women's lives while maintaining a clean public image. Not rumors, not gossip, a pattern. Jaguar claims what people are seeing now didn't start recently. It didn't start with social media reactions or viral clips. It started behind the scenes, where loyalty is negotiated, not promised, and silence is often more valuable than truth. What makes her comments uncomfortable isn't just what she's saying, it's how calmly she's saying it. She doesn't frame this as shock. She frames it as recognition. According to Jaguar, Claressa didn't walk into chaos, she walked into a system. One where strength gets exploited, where confident women are expected to endure quietly, and where public silence is mistaken for private peace. And then she said something that made people pause. She suggested that Claressa's visibility may have been the very thing that made the situation work. Because when the strongest woman in the room looks secure, everyone else stops asking questions. That's when the internet went quiet. Because Jaguar Wright isn't known for protecting reputations. She's known for saying the part most people are afraid to say out loud. And when her version of events lined up with details already circulating, the story stopped feeling speculative. It started feeling familiar. So now the question isn't whether Jaguar should have said it. The question is why so many pieces suddenly fit once she did. According to Jaguar Wright, the biggest mistake people are making is framing this as a love story gone wrong. She says love is the distraction. Jaguar doesn't talk about this situation the way gossip blogs do. She talks about it the way someone does when they've seen the same pattern repeat across decades, across artists, across relationships that look different on the surface but functioned the same underneath. In her view, this wasn't about romance, it was about access. Access to time, access to emotional labor, access to silence. Jaguar claims that in the entertainment industry, relationships are often less about exclusivity and more about management. Who gets visibility, who gets reassurance, who gets kept quiet, and who gets positioned in a way that stabilizes the image. That's where she believes Claressa Shields fits into the picture. According to Jaguar, Claressa's strength, confidence, and public respectability didn't protect her, it made her useful. Because when a woman with credibility stands beside you, questions lose momentum. Doubt feels inappropriate. And criticism sounds like hate instead of concern. This is why Jaguar says people should pay attention to roles, not emotions. She suggests that Claressa wasn't chosen because she was easy to control, but because she was strong enough to endure without immediately collapsing the narrative. Strength in these situations becomes labor, emotional labor that often goes unrecognized because it doesn't look like suffering, it looks like composure. Jaguar also points to silence, not as absence but as currency. According to her, silence in high-profile relationships isn't accidental, it's negotiated, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through pressure, sometimes through the unspoken understanding that speaking up costs more than staying quiet. That's why, she says, public calm should never be confused with private peace. When Jaguar talks about Papoose, she avoids dramatic accusations. Instead, she talks about familiarity. About how men who have navigated the industry for years understand how to keep multiple narratives running at once without letting them collide. Not chaos, coordination. She claims this kind of coordination relies on emotional compartmentalization. Different people receive different versions of truth, different timelines, different expectations. And as long as everyone believes their role is unique, the system holds. What makes this situation stand out to Jaguar is not that it happened, but that it became visible. Visibility is dangerous. According to her, systems like this don't collapse when wrongdoing occurs. They collapse when the wrong person becomes aware of the full picture, or when outside voices start connecting dots that were never meant to align publicly. That's why Jaguar framed her comments carefully. She didn't say she was revealing secrets. She said she was naming a pattern, and patterns don't belong to one person. She also addressed the way the public often responds to women in Claressa's position. Strong women are expected to absorb disappointment quietly. When they don't react dramatically, people assume nothing is wrong. When they do react, they're labeled emotional or unstable. Either way, the focus shifts away from the structure and onto the response. Jaguar says that's intentional, because as long as the conversation stays centered on whether Claressa is okay, no one has to examine how the environment may have failed her. Strength becomes both shield and trap. One of the most uncomfortable points Jaguar raised was about timing. She suggested that things often unravel not when someone lies, but when someone stops believing the version of events they've been given. That shift doesn't announce itself, it shows up in distance, in hesitation, in silence that feels heavier than before. Jaguar didn't claim to know every detail of the situation. What she claimed was something broader. That this story fits a mold she's seen too many times to ignore. And once you recognize the mold, the specifics matter less than the structure holding them in place. That's why she says this was never about love. Love doesn't require silence to survive. Love doesn't need compartmentalization. Love doesn't thrive on imbalance. According to Jaguar Wright, when those elements are present, what you're looking at isn't a relationship, it's an arrangement. And arrangements always favor the person with more power. When Jaguar Wright talks about patterns, she isn't pointing at one couple or one headline. She's pointing at a system she says has survived because it looks normal from the outside. According to Jaguar, the industry doesn't reward honesty, it rewards stability. Not emotional stability, but image stability. The kind that keeps deals intact, relationships marketable, and narratives simple enough to sell. And when an image needs stabilizing, people don't look for the most vulnerable person in the room. They look for the strongest. That's why she believes situations like the one involving Claressa Shields feel familiar. Not because the details are identical, but because the roles are. Jaguar describes a recurring structure. One person carries public credibility. One person controls access and timing. Silence fills the gaps between contradictions. As long as those pieces stay in place, nothing collapses. She argues that strong women are often recruited, intentionally or not, into these structures because they can withstand scrutiny. Their composure buys time. Their confidence lowers suspicion. Their reputation absorbs doubt. And when questions arise, that strength becomes the answer. She's fine, she's strong. She wouldn't tolerate that. Those assumptions do a lot of work. Jaguar also emphasizes how compartmentalization keeps these arrangements running. Different conversations with different people, different promises with different timelines. Not lies shouted across a room, but half-truths delivered privately, each one plausible on its own. The danger only appears when those lanes overlap publicly. That's when the system resists. According to Jaguar, resistance rarely looks like denial, it looks like delay. Minimal statements, strategic quiet, letting attention drift. Because in an environment where attention equals pressure, time becomes leverage. She says this is why silence is often misread as innocence. In reality, it can be maintenance. When Jaguar references Papoose, she avoids specifics and focuses on experience. Artists who have been in the industry long enough learn how to keep momentum without creating friction. They understand when to speak, when to pause, and when letting others fill the silence works in their favor. That doesn't mean wrongdoing, it means fluency. And fluency, Jaguar argues, is often mistaken for morality. The public, she says, wants villains and victims. Systems don't fit neatly into that frame. Systems rely on participation, sometimes voluntary, sometimes coerced by circumstance, sometimes sustained by hope. And hope, especially in high-visibility relationships, can be powerful enough to override doubt. This is where Jaguar says the conversation usually goes wrong. People ask, why didn't she leave? Before asking, what was she told? They ask, why didn't she speak? Before asking, what would it have cost her to speak? Because cost matters. According to Jaguar, silence in these spaces often protects more than one person. It protects teams, brands, futures. And when silence serves multiple interests, breaking it becomes a risk few are encouraged to take. That's why she says stories like this resurface years later, often after distance, after contracts end, after leverage shifts. Not because the truth changed, but because the cost of telling it did. Jaguar also challenges the idea that exposure automatically leads to accountability. In her experience, exposure is often absorbed, reframed, and moved past unless behavior changes. The system doesn't collapse from one reveal. It collapses when participation stops. That's the part she believes people miss. Strength doesn't dismantle systems by enduring them. Clarity does by withdrawing from them. And that withdrawal doesn't always come with announcements. It shows up as distance, as refusal, as no longer playing the stabilizing role everyone benefited from. Jaguar's message isn't that anyone here is uniquely guilty. It's that the pattern is old and recognizable. And once you see it, you stop reacting to headlines and start watching behavior. Who clarifies timelines, who avoids specifics, who benefits from quiet. Those answers don't trend, but they last. The story didn't change when new details surfaced. It changed when Jaguar Wright said the quiet part out loud. Before that, everything could still be dismissed as speculation. Rumors, internet noise, competing narratives. But Jaguar didn't approach this like gossip. She approached it like recognition. And that distinction mattered. According to Jaguar, the reason her words landed wasn't because she revealed something brand new. It's because she named the structure people were already sensing but didn't know how to articulate. Once she framed the situation as a familiar industry pattern, the details stopped floating independently. They started connecting. That's when silence took on a different meaning. Silence in isolation can mean many things: privacy, restraint, confusion. But silence after pattern recognition feels intentional, it feels strategic. Jaguar emphasized that in her experience, silence often isn't about avoiding the truth. It's about waiting for momentum to die. And momentum always dies eventually. This is why she believes timing matters more than receipts. Receipts can be challenged, interpreted, discredited, but timing reveals intention. Who speaks immediately, who delays, who lets others exhaust themselves debating while they remain untouched. According to Jaguar, silence isn't passive. It's a tactic that relies on public fatigue. When the names Claressa, Shields, and Papoose were first linked to controversy, attention surged, questions circulated, opinions formed. But instead of escalation, what followed was restraint. Minimal engagement, no full narratives, no clear dismantling of claims. That restraint reframed everything. Because when accusations are false, people usually rush to clarify specifics. Dates, context, misunderstandings. According to Jaguar, the absence of that specificity doesn't confirm guilt, but it does confirm calculation. Calculation about what's worth addressing. Calculation about what can be ignored. Calculation about how long silence can hold. Jaguar also pointed out how public perception often shifts responsibility away from structure and onto reaction. If Claressa appears calm, the assumption becomes that nothing is wrong. If she reacts emotionally, the focus shifts to her tone instead of the circumstances. Either way, the system remains untouched. That's not coincidence, that's design. She believes Claressa's public composure may be less about denial and more about assessment. When you realize the environment you're in doesn't reward honesty, you stop offering it freely. Silence becomes a form of self-preservation. And that's where this story stands now, not at resolution but at tension. Jaguar didn't demand explanations. She didn't push confrontation. She simply named a pattern and stepped back. And that, she suggests, is often the most disruptive move. Because once a pattern is named, everyone involved has to decide whether to keep participating in it. The public now watches differently. They're no longer waiting for dramatic reveals. They're watching behavior, who shows up together, who avoids clarity, who lets the conversation drift instead of closing it. Those details accumulate quietly and quietly change perception. Jaguar has said that systems don't collapse when exposed. They collapse when they're no longer convenient, when the people propping them up stop doing emotional labor for free, when silence stops benefiting everyone equally. That's why she believes this moment matters, even if nothing happens next. Because silence after exposure isn't empty, it's loaded. And loaded silence always precedes a shift, either toward accountability or toward distance. Which direction this goes doesn't depend on the internet. It depends on who decides to keep absorbing pressure and who decides to step away from it. At this point, the story isn't waiting on new information. It's waiting on a decision. According to Jaguar Wright, moments like this are never about exposure alone. They're about what happens after exposure, when the noise fades and only patterns remain. For Claressa Shields, the pressure isn't coming from the internet. It's coming from clarity, because once a pattern is visible, pretending not to see it becomes harder than addressing it. And that's where power quietly shifts. Jaguar has repeatedly emphasized that strength doesn't protect women in these situations, it often traps them. Strong women are expected to endure quietly, to stay composed, to be above the drama. And that expectation can turn into unpaid emotional labor, where maintaining the image becomes more important than protecting the self. This is where the choice appears. Walking away wouldn't just change a relationship. It would change a narrative that benefited from Claressa's stability and credibility. It would mean refusing to be the anchor that keeps everything else calm. And that refusal, quiet or loud, has consequences. Staying, on the other hand, demands compartmentalization, living with what you now understand, accepting ambiguity as permanent, choosing silence not as strategy but as routine. Over time, that choice doesn't look dramatic, but it reshapes self-respect. Neither option is easy, both come with loss. Jaguar's point isn't that Claressa owes the public an explanation. It's that the public often misunderstands what silence actually costs. Silence isn't free, it protects some people while draining others. And once that imbalance becomes clear, silence stops feeling neutral. This is also where Papoose fits back into the conversation, not through accusations but through positioning. Minimal engagement keeps flexibility intact. Avoiding specifics keeps narratives open. And in systems Jaguar says she's seen before, openness without clarity almost always benefits the person with more leverage. What makes this moment different is awareness. Once awareness sets in, participation becomes a choice. Not an accident, not a misunderstanding, a choice about what role you're willing to keep playing. Jaguar has said many times that systems don't end with confrontation, they end with withdrawal. When the strongest person in the room stops carrying weight that was never theirs to begin with. And that withdrawal doesn't need a headline, it shows up in distance, in boundaries, in no longer explaining what should be obvious. This is where Claressa's story now sits, not at a public collapse but at a private crossroads. And the most important thing is this: whatever choice she makes will likely happen quietly, long before the public understands it. Because real shifts don't announce themselves, they reveal themselves over time. At this point, this isn't about who said what, it's about what was recognized. Because when someone like Jaguar Wright names a pattern, it forces a different kind of attention. Not toward gossip, but toward structure, toward power, toward who benefits when silence holds and who pays for it. So here's the real question: was this ever about love or was it about management? Was strength being honored or exploited? And when silence becomes heavier than speaking, who actually has the power? Because walking away costs pride, staying costs self-respect, and neither choice leaves you untouched. Now it's on you. Do you think Jaguar Wright is naming a real industry pattern or projecting her own experience? Do you think Claressa's silence is protection or pressure? And how long can any system survive once people stop pretending not to see it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this before it disappears into the timeline, because the most dangerous truths aren't leaked, they're recognized.